listener production. Just before we get started, a warning. This episode's deep dive discusses voluntary assisted dying. If that's not for you, you can skip forward the next 30 seconds to get to the start of the headlines. A new report on Australia's voluntary assisted dying laws was handed down in federal parliament yesterday. It found euthanasia is more widely accepted than ever before. And it begs the question, what took so long? It's an important conversation as our parents age.
I think the thing the report shows is that there's overwhelmingly a positive story around voluntary assisted dying services. It wasn't a huge surprise. It was more of a confirmation of what we've been hearing from people over the last few years, but it was great to see that's really cemented in the data.
That discussion is coming up in the second half of this episode. First, though, it is time for the headlines with Bension Siebert. Today's Tuesday, August 13.
Good morning, Sacha. Pressure is growing on Labor to adopt a complete ban of gambling ads, but the government looks set to reject those calls. It's currently considering the results from the 2022 inquiry into online gambling harm, with changes to legislation due this week. Labor Minister Bill Shorten has tempered expectations of a total ban, saying it could destroy free-to-air TV.
The problem is if you kill free-to-air media, what's going to replace it? And okay, I'm just going to say it. I don't want Mark Zuckerberg or Facebook in charge of my news feeds. He's not even paying the Australian media for what they report.
Bill Shorten on ABC's Q&A there. Labor is instead considering a cap on the ads that can play during general TV programming, limiting the number of gambling ads during sport and banning them during kids' shows, but we'll know more when the new legislation is unveiled. The federal government has been lobbied by crossbenchers and even former Prime Ministers John Howard and Malcolm Turnbull to do a total ban.
Yeah, and we've seen some quite fiery comments from Independent Senator Jackie Lambie, who said that neither side, neither the Labor nor the Liberals, have the guts to do this. So it is getting pretty fiery. But the issue with a total ban, Bill Shorten is right. The revenue for media companies, unfortunately, it is a fact of life that it heavily relies on advertising dollars from these gambling companies. If that is pulled, the question is, can those media companies survive? And it's a big question mark. We don't know. According to Shorten, these companies are already in diabolical trouble. So if you then take away a huge chunk of revenue, you know, that leaves them in a pretty precarious position. And interestingly, though, I think that the groundswell support for a total ban isn't anything to ignore or to be sneezed at. We did put a question up in our broadcast channel Behind the Briefing, which is on Instagram. If you haven't yet, please go and check it out and join us there. But we asked, do you support a total ban on gambling advertising? And 97% of people said yes. So that was the respondents, our listeners who felt that way. So, yeah, I don't know if it's going to be popular if Labor doesn't do this, but I can also understand Bill Shorten's position that if we pull all advertising, then we might have to say goodbye to free-to-air TV.
Yeah, it's a really difficult policy question for the government, and certainly there would be advocates on the other side saying, well, people are dying on a daily basis as a result of gambling addiction, and to hell with the media companies if that's what has to happen. So it will be really interesting to see what the government comes up with this new legislation.
The top commander of Ukraine's military says it now controls more than 1,000 square kilometres of Russian territory. Ukrainian forces started their surprise incursion into Russia a week ago, but President Volodymyr Zelensky only acknowledged it was happening yesterday. The offensive took Moscow by surprise and has been an embarrassment to Russian military leaders. Zelensky says war is coming back to Russia after Moscow had taken it to other countries. We have heard from Russian leader Vladimir Putin. He said it was, quote, a major provocation, and he's ordered Russian forces to kick the enemy out of our territory. About 120,000 people have now reportedly been evacuated from the Russian city of Kursk, which is about 170 k's northeast of the Ukrainian border. Bension, this is something that's going to be worth watching because it hasn't been made clear exactly what Ukraine's objective is here. Volodymyr Zelensky, as we said, didn't address this until yesterday, even though it's been going on for a week. What he's trying to achieve, whether it's just to say, hey, we're here and we can push forward into your territory too, or whether there's something else going on, remains to be seen.
Yeah, and certainly earlier on in the war, Volodymyr Zelensky was pretty adamant that it was not going to be a war on Russian territory, and this is a new strategy from the Ukrainians. There is certainly the danger that this provokes more Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilians, but we've seen plenty of that already. A prominent Republican has urged Donald Trump to stop questioning Kamala Harris's crowd sizes after the former president has had multiple public meltdowns over it. To recap, there's been a lot of hype around the new Democratic nominee and her running mate. In the last week, the pair have been greeted by pretty decent audiences at all their events so far, but Trump has used a press conference and Truth Social posts to accuse Harris HQ of faking images of crowds using AI and saying their campaign is cheating.
Now Republican former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy has spoken publicly about the 78-year-old's ranting, and he's urged him to focus on policies and not personalities in the race to the White House. McCarthy said there's only a short time left in the race, and he's not wrong, 84 days to be exact until the US heads to the polls. It's worth noting, though, Trump might finally be kind of pulling his campaign together. There has been criticism, we've heard from McCarthy, but from other people right across the political spectrum who have said he's struggled to switch from having Joe Biden as his opponent and saying, oh, Crooked Joe and Sleepy Joe, he had a really clear message with Biden. Now he's got Kamala Harris and he's struggled to define her and how he should rally against her, I suppose. He's taken to X this morning for the first time in a year, and he started posting about Kamala Harris, and he's painting her as a, quote, San Francisco radical, so really trying to highlight her more progressive policies. It's interesting that he's back on X because he's also posted that he is going to be interviewed by none other than Elon Musk. That is happening today at some point. So that'll be an interesting one to watch. It has been called by Trump's people the interview of the century.
I have to roll my eyes. I'm so sorry. I think this does kind of show, and I think we can go back to Donald Trump questioning Kamala Harris's race and him talking about her crowd sizes. I think that it's really shown that Kamala Harris has rattled this man on a personal level, and I think that it shows that her strategies are working by pivoting from presenting him as this kind of super villain to presenting him as this weird old guy. It's really helped maintain the momentum that she had when she replaced Joe Biden. And there's been massive grassroots organising, including through these huge Zoom calls. And now I think we've noticed that the Swifties are getting involved. There's a Swifties for Harris campaign. And she's also got access to a massive amount of money, both from the Harris-Biden campaign, but also with the record hundreds of millions of dollars in donations that she's received since. So at the moment, it's a big moment for Kamala Harris. And just remember, like 3 weeks ago, Trump looked unstoppable. So it has been absolute whiplash in US politics. And Miley Cyrus has become the youngest star to receive Disney legend status at 31 years old. Cyrus rose to fame in the Disney Channel series Hannah Montana when she was just 13, which she said was still one of her proudest moments.
But in my heart, I was Hannah Montana. And I was so proud to be. This award is dedicated to Hannah and all of her amazing, loyal fans, and to everyone who has made my dream a reality.
Cyrus received a standing ovation from the 12,000-strong crowd at the awards ceremony in Anaheim, California, the home of Disneyland.
Yeah, so Miley did leave her Disney Kid image behind back in 2013 with the release of her fourth album, Bangers. Now, her antics at the time did get some mixed reviews. We had her grinding on stage at the MTV Awards with Robin Thicke. She was lighting up joints on red carpets. Like, she was being obviously provocative, trying to shed her skin as this squeaky clean Disney kid. But if you look back now, the Bangers era is widely considered successful and the music was good, and, you know, so she came through on the other side of that. She's even acknowledged between 2013 and 2016 she was malfunctioning a little bit, but I think it was good for her. She'd grown up, you know, constrained by Disney, and you know, she was finally breaking free. But since then as well, her music career hasn't stopped. She won her first Grammy earlier this year for Flowers, which was named the 2023 Record of the Year. So good on Miley. We love to see a Disney kid breaking free and being successful.
Absolutely. And if there's any evidence that she has managed that turnaround very well, we've got Jojo Siwa making an attempt of her own. I guess they're going a little differently so far, Sasha.
Yeah. Bension, thank you so much for joining me for the headlines. Next up, a change of pace and again a trigger warning. We are going to be discussing voluntary assisted dying laws and what we've learned over the last few years since they were brought in Australia. For a long time, the idea of being able to access euthanasia when terminally ill was viewed as controversial. It wasn't until 2019 that the first Australian state, Victoria, passed laws that allowed the practice, called voluntary assisted dying. Over the next 5 years, the other states followed suit, except for the Northern Territory. While the laws are still new, there is a lot we can learn from the last few years. Who is accessing the practice, how they've been supported, and where the system is currently falling short. Yesterday, a report was delivered to Federal Parliament offering the first thorough review of the country's voluntary assisted dying laws and how they've worked so far. To tell us about the report and what we've learned so far, I'm joined now by Dr Linda Swan, the CEO of Go Gentle Australia. Dr Swan, welcome to the briefing. You presented this study in Canberra yesterday. Were there any big surprises for you in the report?
I think the thing the report shows is that there's overwhelmingly a positive story around voluntary assisted dying services. It wasn't a huge surprise. It was more of a confirmation of what we've been hearing from people over the last few years, but it was great to see that's really cemented in the data.
Yeah, so do you think the system is working so far, and what sort of evidence have we seen of that so far?
Well, what we are seeing from the report is that we now have transparent data being reported across all jurisdictions. So that's across Australia and New Zealand. The ACT has yet to be able to implement the laws, even though it is legal there. But what we're getting from all these different jurisdictions is a real richness of data that enables us to stop and look at, well, where are things different? And does that difference mean that there's something that we could do better? So this is really what you call good clinical governance. It's when you stop and look at a health service, work out what's working well, and where there might be an opportunity to do things better.
Yeah, okay. So tell us about the age breakdowns of people who are accessing voluntary assisted dying. What are we learning about, you know, the breakdown of ages and who is looking to take part in it?
So it is really, again, no great surprises in terms of the types of people who are accessing voluntary assisted dying. They're older, they tend to be male, they most commonly have a cancer diagnosis. So what we know, by virtue of definition with voluntary assisted dying, in order to be eligible for the law, you have to have a terminal illness at the end of your life, and you have to be suffering. So by nature, that means that it's more likely that the people that are accessing the laws are older, and that they have, by qualification, they need to have a terminal illness.
So we've seen the majority of people accessing this be in the older age cohort, but are we seeing young people with terminal illnesses also looking to access voluntary assisted dying?
It does happen. I mean, it's always any deaths, it can be a tragedy for sure, but it's particularly tragic in the instance where you're dealing with a young person. But there are examples cancer's indiscriminate. There are young people who get cancer diagnoses and, they can suffer at the end of life like anybody can, and that's an incredibly difficult and challenging circumstance. Fortunately, it's relatively rare, but yes, it does happen. And so there's been a variety of people accessing voluntary assisted dying across all age groups and across a range of different conditions.
I'm keen to hear your thoughts about community, specifically what, the average punter in the street might feel about VAD laws, given they've now been in place in a number of states for a few years here or there. Are we seeing an evolution in how the average person is viewing voluntary assisted dying?
I think the overwhelming thing I've heard when I talk to people about the report is a lot of people are surprised that voluntary assisted dying has been legal for as long as it has. It's over 5 years now in Victoria. That's often a cause of surprise. And then also there's a little bit of surprise about the fact that it's not straightforward. It's great that it's legal, but as the report shows, it's got very strict eligibility criteria and the laws are by nature, by design, quite complex. This is to make sure that there are lots of safeguards to ensure only the right people get access and that we're very clear that the people accessing the law are doing so based on their own choice. So protections around people's ability to ensure that there's no coercion is at the heart of all the laws. And they're the things that really reassure people, to know that there's good controls in place to make sure the people that really need it are getting access, and there are good controls in place to ensure that there's no risk that people are being, inappropriately encouraged to access assisted dying. I'll just labour that point one step further. When we actually looked at the data, is there any evidence that any of the cases had any aspect of coercion? There is not a single example of that. Every single case is reviewed by an independent review board. Coercion of people into voluntary assisted dying is not occurring.
What about outspoken opponents to voluntary assisted dying? These are the ones that fought actively against the laws being brought in across the states. Are we seeing a softening in their stance to the practice at all now that it's been in place for a few years?
Yeah, absolutely. It's delightful to see how relatively quickly voluntary assisted dying is being accepted as just a choice at the end of life, which is what it is. It is part of end of life. It's not for everybody. Only about 1% of deaths are from people who take a voluntary assisted dying substance. It's a tiny proportion. But for those people who are at the end of their life and they're suffering and dying, it's a really valuable way that they can really regain some control and sense that they're in charge at the end of their life. So people love to hear those stories. It's really reassuring in terms of making people understand that voluntary assisted dying is delivering choice, compassion and control at the end of life.
How are most people ending their lives through this program? Is there only one way that they can do it, or is it one of those things where there's a few different options?
There are a few different options. It's highly regulated, but in essence, the options are quite similar. There's a voluntary assisted dying substance, and that is produced by a central pharmacy in every state. And when you complete your way through the process, and that process takes between 2 and 4 weeks, sometimes longer, so it's a long, slow and careful process. And it depends a little on the state what options are available. But the options that are available are that you might take the substance yourself, you might choose to have someone help you drink the substance, or you might ask a health practitioner to help you in terms of actually having a injection to administer the substance. So it's basically the same type of substance and it's administered in different ways.
Look, our listeners would not fall into the average age of a person who is looking to access voluntary assisted dying. However, our parents would be starting to enter that age group, if not already be there. And I suppose as we go on with time, it will become more normal, more accessible, I suppose. Well, you'd hope so for people who genuinely need to access voluntary assisted dying. I suppose with that said, my question to you is, how should you respond as a loved one to someone you know saying, I want to or I'm considering accessing voluntary assisted dying? How can we be, good family members, good friends when that conversation might come up?
So firstly, should that question come up or that conversation come up, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that's actually taken a great deal of bravery on that person to even initiate that conversation. And the worst thing you can do is shut them down by saying, oh, let's not talk about that, or don't be silly, Dad or Mum. No, we don't want to talk about that, because they do want to talk about it. That was a difficult statement or conversation to start. So the best thing you could possibly do is acknowledge that, and if necessary, say that let's have a chat about it later if for some reason you're not ready for the conversation yet. But if anything, it's about listening and understanding what their needs are. Everybody's needs are different at the end of life. It's very hard to guess what somebody really wants unless you actually have a conversation with them. And what we do hear from people that support people through voluntary assisted dying is that when it's clear what a person wants, it is such a relief, not only for that person to know those wishes will be met, but for those around them, their carers, their loved ones, their families. It's so lovely when you know what they want. And so what you have to do is just do what they want. It's not this constant debate about, I don't know what you were doing, I don't know what Dad wants, I'm not sure what we should do. This is what the whole process of having end-of-life conversations can do. It can make it not only easier on the person that's going to have to make the decision if they want voluntary assisted dying or not, but it's helpful for all the people around to feel that they're supporting their loved one through that journey.
Dr Swan, before we let you go, what reforms are you looking to start getting work started on in the wake of this report? What needs to change, do you think, most urgently, or what needs the most attention right now?
So what we know is that the voluntary assisted dying laws are working well, but there are some barriers that are really causing problems with access. One of the most crazy, ridiculous ones is that an old Commonwealth law prohibits the use of telehealth for voluntary assisted dying. It was never intended to have that effect, but because it's an old law, but it does. And this means some crazy workarounds where people are driving hundreds of kilometres to see people when they could have had a telephone call, or even things like faxing scripts, which is so normal in healthcare, you can't do with voluntary assisted dying. So, I mean, I'm sure younger people will totally understand the value of technology, and it is crazy that we're not leveraging that to its full capacity in voluntary assisted dying services.
Dr Swan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. We do appreciate it.
I really appreciate your coverage, and one thing we do know is there's still a need to raise awareness around voluntary assisted dying, so thank you for your help with that.
That was Dr Linda Swan, CEO of Go Gentle Australia. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. Thank you for listening. Before you go, we would really love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, we are on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. You can also check us out on TikTok and YouTube, search Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed with another ep this afternoon from 3. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you then.
Listener.